Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Cara.
Today's episode it's like an amazing gift for all the adults out there who either didn't have any sex education of their own that they can remember, or it looked really different when they were growing up and they feel totally lost as to how to go about it, particularly with their boys. And so I want to introduce our guest, Chris Miller. But before I do that, I want to just mention that within our community membership, we have a class that is available for any adult. So parent, grandparent, coach, mentor, healthcare provider, therapist, educator, you name it, who wants more information about exactly this, who needs a refresher on specifics about health and sex education because they're trying to have these conversations with kids in their lives and they don't know the basics or they don't remember the basics. But Chris gets into so many of the basics.
Chris is so much fun. He's joyful and energetic. He has a mental health background. He's a clinical psychologist and has been working with tween and teen and boys and young men for 2.5 decades. He's also the founder of, I love this acronym, the Boys Institute for Growth, BIG, which is based in San Diego, and it focuses on educating and supporting preteen, teen, and young adult males and their families. He runs puberty workshops. He does social emotional learning. And what I love about Chris and this episode is that he just keeps it so real. Like, he gets boys. He has joy and appreciation for who they are and how they think and the questions they ask. And it's really inspirational for those of us caring for boys in any setting to remember to give them the benefit of the doubt, use our sense of humor, and just do our best to connect to them in any way we can. So enjoy this episode. We can't wait to hear what you think. Hi, Chris.
Hey, how are you guys?
We're happy to have you on. That was probably the most low energy comment you're going to make on this whole recording because we know how effervescent you are, Chris.
Yes. Yeah. No pressure. No pressure. No, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Chris, can you tell our audience a little bit about your work, clinical and educational work with boys, and how that ties into puberty specifically?
Sure. So I am a licensed psychologist, and in today's day and age, what that means is you can do a lot of things as a licensed psychologist. And my background is I sort of wear two hats. One is clinical. So I've had the pleasure for about 25 years of working with mostly boys, preteen boys, teen boys, young men, and their families in therapy. I think a lot of that was generated because of who I was as a guy. I was a guy, and I got a lot of early referrals in my private practice from colleagues, probably because I was a guy. And there's a paucity of guy therapists even nowadays. So I woke up one day years after starting my practice and realized, as I looked at my schedule, I got all guys on my schedule, which was actually great. I loved it. I loved working with them. Of all ages, as I've said, all kinds of different issues and struggles and backgrounds. And so most of my career has been doing clinical work and helping boys and young men develop good, solid, healthy connections with family, with friends, with lovers, managing tough emotions, managing behavior, et cetera. So that's been really rewarding. Another hat that found me, I didn't find it, was in the sexual health ed realm. And so, I don't know, 2008, I got a phone call from a local pediatrician down here in San Diego. I practiced down in San Diego. And this pediatrician had a really great reputation of being a good pediatrician, but also she was one of the pioneers of doing sex ed work with girls, 4th through 6th grade girls down in San Diego and in SoCal. And she had a program called the Healthy Chats for Girls program, and she had done that for years. where she met with these groups of girls and their parents together to educate them on puberty, development, sex, all of it.
She's incredible, by the way. Her work is
yeah.
incredible. She's phenomenal.
Yes, Crystal DeFreitas. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got a phone call from her one day out of the blue. I had never talked to her. And apparently, in the years leading up to this phone call, a lot of these girls, their parents also had sons. And so they were constantly asking Dr. DeFreitas, hey, where's the boys' talk? Like, you do the girls' talks, you should do boys' talks. So she said, I'm going to do boys' talks. So she did for about 2 months. And then she called me and she said, hey, we haven't talked before. I heard you do lots of work with boys. Here's what we're doing. I've done talks with the boys for a couple months. I can't do it. Why not? They're way too squirrely. They're way too silly. They're immature. They fart too much. They smell. I just can't do this. Like,
welcome to my house, Chris.
Yes, this is not my thing. Is this something you would be interested in? And double thumbs up right away. Like, absolutely. I would love to do this. I don't have that much experience doing this kind of education. She said, doesn't matter. I'll teach you. So I cut my teeth working with her, doing the Healthy Chats for Boys program. I then broke away from that with her blessing, just because I wanted to kind of do a little bit more with it and do multiple groups with multiple sessions with the same group over the years, which I thought would be a really interesting endeavor. So I started the Big Talks for Boys program. That's been going for, 12, 13 years. And so it's mainly 2 meetings separated by about 2 years. 4th, 5th, 6th grade boys, we do the body basics, we do puberty basics, we do reproduction basics, and then we take a break. And then 7th, 8th grade, we do an updated talk for them and their parents. The parents are with them while I am teaching them, which is a really kind of unique opportunity for me.
So now we're going to press pause because it's time to pull the lens back a little bit. So you've been doing this a long time. You've been a clinical psychologist for 25 years.
Yeah.
You've been doing health and sex education very specifically since at least 2008. And the first question that people are going to ask us, they do ask us. So I'm going to ask you, what has changed? What's the biggest difference that you see today? Let's go to the 2008. Between 2008 today, name a massive tectonic shift?
So I think in the time I've done this, the 14, 15 years, I've done the sex health ed talks. I think there has been some interesting changes. I think I'm still somewhat surprised that when I talk to these boys, they know more coming in than the boys did a decade and a half ago. And that's, I think, a credit to the trusted adults. I think there's been so much great work in guiding parents to start talking to their kids about changing bodies, puberty, sex, etc. And so a lot of them know more than you would think. There's plenty that don't, but I've seen that kind of shift where their baseline knowledge coming in tends to be more thorough and just better than it was a decade and a half ago. That's one of the big changes that I've seen. Another change is...
Can I just say, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I think people are so sure everyone is ill-informed and everyone's running around with so much bad information. And this is not to say that people are running around with no bad information, but what I'm hearing you say is there's actually a lot of good information out there too.
A ton of it. I mean, way more good information than there was in, the late aughts, for sure. And I see this. I also see an interesting dynamic with the boys compared to when I started doing it. And I think it could be labeled as sort of a shift is I think there's a, they can be silly and squirrely. But when Dr. DeFreitas mentioned that when she first called me, I wouldn't say more mature group of boys. I would just say a more informed and also a more sort of sensitive, empathic, sympathetic group of boys, especially when we talk about all of the changes that are coming for them and for the girls. It's a really heartening thing to see when I go into the nuts and bolts of menstruation or the timing of puberty, and that in this group of you friends that I'm looking at right now, one of you will be the first to start puberty. And that can be tricky. It can be exciting, but it can also be difficult. We really want you guys to be kind and caring and not give each other crap about starting puberty. And one of you in this group will be the last. And that can be a challenge too. And we need to be really kind and caring toward that friend. He will be smaller, he will be not as strong, and he will have feelings about this. And so you guys need to be really kind to each other about everyone going through this at their own pace. And you just see lots of nods and understanding. So that's a different shift, but that was also unexpected. Like you see just a lot of understanding and kind of sympathy, empathy from these boys nowadays, more so than back in the day.
Yeah. I mean, Chris, that flies in the face of what many of us are so worried about, which is kind of the disenfranchisement of boys, the feeling that boys have, the feeling that boys are being socialized in really scary and negative ways, right? The sort of the phrase toxic masculinity that gets thrown around, that they're not developing these skills, that the world is not helping them build these social emotional qualities. And yet you work with thousands of boys and you're seeing something else. So I just want listeners to hear, like, there's really good stuff happening and there are qualities being cultivated in these boys, and that it does work and it does make a difference. And the clickbait news of it all isn't the only story that needs to be told. Chris, I want to get at, because when we first met you, this was like what I was so excited about. So you've worked with thousands of boys over a decade and a half in these classes, and then 2.5 decades in your practice. What are the most common questions that you get from boys? And we can divide them, like, we can categorize them into like the most shocking or the funniest, or, you know, the ones you've heard the most over the years, however you want to do it. But like, what are the things that come up over and over again when you work with boys?
I've got a long list. Although there are some go-tos that almost every talk I do, and as I said, I do tons of these that come up. So, and maybe it'll be fun to, if you guys want to chime in, if you think you know the answers to some of these questions, go for it.
Oh, I hear a challenge. Okay, here we go.
And you can fact check me too.
Like we're playing the Sunday puzzle.
Okay, so when I explain, and again, this basics talk is like, first half is all about puberty, the basics of puberty, what to expect, body changes, brain changes, emotional changes, taking care of yourself, all that good stuff. Then the second half is all about reproduction, reproductive anatomy, mechanics of sexual intercourse, ejaculation, all that good stuff. And so when we teach the boys about egg cell, sperm cell, they got to meet. And if a sperm cell finds an egg cell and it burrows its way inside, this is what happens. And we explain this. Almost always a boy's hand will go up and because I don't want to stereotype, boys are so interested in this race and who wins. And so a hand will go up and a boy will say, what if it's a tie? What if 2 sperm cells get in exactly at the same time? What happens? What happens? Do you guys know?
Go, Vanessa.
I'm not the doctor.
I was going to say, the MD has an advantage here.
I mean, I think, let me tee it up this way, and then I would love to hear how you phrase it.
Yeah.
It is not that the number of chromosomes in a cell, right, is fixed. You cannot get chromosomes donated from 2 different sperm cells and 1 egg cell and have sort of 3 copies of each chromosome. The body only builds itself based upon 2 copies of each chromosome. And there are versions of that look different when certain chromosomes do actually multiply and all that. But like for very basics, so you cannot have a mashup of the cellular material from 2 different sperm and an egg.
So do you want to hear the non-MD answer?
I do.
there's too many chefs in the kitchen.
Oh, I like that answer.
No, but I say extremely rare. It's possible. It happens very, very rarely. But when that happens, there's too many genetic instructions, and the cells, the egg and the sperm won't combine in the way that it needs to, and it won't grow. The cells won't grow, and that won't grow into a baby or develop into a baby.
The math doesn't work.
The math doesn't work. Another interesting question that I get on the heels of that is the boys will raise their hand and say, well, but so when the sperm goes inside the egg, like how come other sperm cells don't just go inside the egg? Why don't a bunch of them go in? And that also, I'll explain is it happens when that sperm cell and egg cell meet, the egg cell sort of releases a chemical, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that basically gets the outer part of the egg to kind of harden and make. It's
unbelievable. It's
I call it like a force field. It makes a force field. So
that's
nothing
exactly
else
right.
can get in.
So
that's exactly
what does that tell you? I mean, I get the race and who wins and what if it's a tie, right? Like when we think about boys in our culture and kind of what they're interested in these years, many of them, it's, it's sort of competition and sort of external validation and all of that stuff. But there's another layer in that second question, right? Like, do more sperm have a chance? What happens what does that tell you about what's going on in boys' minds? And we'll get to some of the pubertal changes and not the reproductive stuff, but what insights do you gain when you hear that kind of question?
Yeah, I don't know. That's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about it. I mean, on the and in connection with that too, they're also very interested in and what happens to all the other sperm cells? So they're just hanging out. Like where do they go? And so they're interested in that too. I don't know if it on some level, and it's speculative, right? I don't know if for some boys it has to do with just specialness and uniqueness and how unique am I and how I got made. I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't really given it much thought. I would be interested to see what you think about that.
I mean, it sort of takes me to the place of inclusion and exclusion. And I don't want to say making the team. I mean, that's sort of like a 1980s version of it, but like Rudy, the movie. But it does make me think about how they personalize the journey and how it's how does this reflect my life or my experience? Am I in? Am I out? Did I make it? Did I not make it? What happens when you walk off the field? I don't know. It's a very. Oh
my God, I have such a different take. What the actual are you talking about? How about this one? They've been told probably 5 minutes before how many millions of sperm they produce.
This is true.
Right? They are told a mind-boggling number of sperm are going to come out of their body on a regular basis. And now they have to frame shift and they have to wrap their brain around, well, exactly one of them is able to penetrate this egg. And the ones who are kind of macro thinkers are like, wait a second. There are millions of these things, and now it's a one-to-one equation and get me from point A to point B. That's how I thought about it. But see, this is the Cara versus Vanessa.
I know, it's true.
Thinking, and this is why we're such good partners.
That's why you're here, Chris, is to mediate the very extreme poles of our perspective.
It's a wonderful yin-yang. It's like two ways through.
Well, and I will tell you this, a really poignant part of my time together with groups of boys is just this, right? Because they've learned up until this point, they have lots of questions about ejaculation. Of course, when you explain ejaculation to the boys, and they've gotten all the information they need in the talk up until that moment, they know what sperm cells are, they know where they're made, they know the purpose of the testicles to produce these sperm cells. They also know that pre-puberty, their body can't make these cells. They know all that. And then they have tons of questions when they learn what ejaculation is. And by the way, this is horrifying for some boys.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, what are you talking about? Sperm cells leave my body out through the tip of the penis? Time out. And they have a million expected and understandable questions, right? And so just to super rapid fire it, like, does this hurt? A lot of boys are worried that this might hurt. So they want to know, does it hurt? Does it feel good? Or does it feel like nothing, like sort of maybe like peeing?
And I don't think people give boys credit for worrying about if it hurts.
No, they
never,
do.
Right? People, I think especially when you're the adult managing the question, like periods hurt. That people give credit for that.
Well, because they've heard people talk about how much having your period hurts, how much it sucks, cramping, blah, 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 blah. But nobody, I mean, this is to our point, Chris. It's like ejaculation, boners, and wet dreams are a punchline in our culture, but nobody has serious conversations with boys about it in a scientific way, in an empathic way. I'm curious, Chris, when we speak to men, one of the number one most difficult and sometimes even traumatic things we hear from men is about having had wet dreams and not knowing what they were, or having had boners, erections in settings that were deeply inconvenient and having stuff happen in that context. And I'm curious, do you hear about that stuff from the boys when you talk to them? Are they worried about it? Have they had these experiences and they want to unpack it with you?
More with the 7th, 8th grade boys, with the 4th through 6th grade boys. Because a lot of the 4th through 6th grade boys, some of them have started puberty. Maybe some of them have had some wet dreams and a lot more spontaneous erections, but a lot of them haven't. This is more what's coming.
Right.
And so I try to front load as much as I can to demystify and help them manage any worries they might have by giving them good information. So when we talk about ejaculation, right, we walk through like the questions they have, and I'll come back to your question in 1 second. Doesn't hurt. Actually, the good news is it feels really good. When a male ejaculates, that actually feels really, really good. Giggle, giggle, giggle. They get silly about that. And then the questions keep coming, right? So the questions are like, okay, so like how much comes out? Like when you pee? We educate them on that. And actually, I'll take my prop, like a teaspoon, and say, actually, no, a lot less. So between a half a teaspoon to maybe a teaspoon and a half. So let's take the middle, about a teaspoon, not that much comes out. Okay, what's it look like? Does it look like pee? No, it actually looks very, very different than pee. It's white in color, grayish white in color, and it's actually a little bit thicker than urine. By the way, a super funny response I got to this that's sort of classic that I think you'll like. So I was doing this talk and I said that it's a thicker substance than urine. Kid raises his hand. Like yogurt? So like yogurt? And I said, not yogurt. No, yogurt's way, way thicker. And so the boy goes, so like drinkable yogurt?
Oh, bless.
And the parents are sitting behind them, and the parents are all like, oh my God. And I said, you know what? Drinkable yogurt.
Kefir. Absolutely.
Okay, how about the parents who are sitting behind, or frankly, any of the parents who are listening to this podcast right now who are thinking, my kid would never ask those questions. How do I get my kid? I share this piece of information. How do I get my kid to engage with me and ask? Or do I start answering questions I anticipate if my kid's not asking?
Right. So that's a really good point. So I actually will do that in most of my talks because I've done this so long and with so many boys. I know that these are the questions, for example, about ejaculation. Like I know they're up there because they're asked a lot, but they're not always. So I will do it for them in a way. I'll preemptively kind of say, hey, so like boys have a lot of questions about this. Some of you may be thinking of those questions right now. I'm going to actually go through the really common questions that boys will ask about ejaculation, just to make sure that you understand and you get maybe some of your questions answered. You can ask away and then I'll go through. And if one of those questions isn't asked, I will bring it up to make sure that they get that information. So parents could do that. They can,
right? And the way they can do it, because their kids are like, you are no expert on this, right? An immediate cred loser. So the way a parent or a trusted adult can do this is they can say, I was just listening to this podcast and there's this guy who's an expert at this, and he listed the most common questions that kids ask. So I'm thinking maybe you have these questions too, right? So like, parent, you do not have to be the expert. And in fact, when you are not the expert, it tends to work better.
Agreed. Totally agreed.
And Chris, what I'm hearing from you is there's a desire for sort of concrete, tangible information, like down to the,
especially at this age.
Right. So down to the like drinkable yogurt,
Yeah.
not Greek yogurt, which is thicker, and it's so funny because when we teach kids, all kids, and frankly, adults about vaginal discharge, I'm like, yeah, it's like egg white. It's like uncooked egg white. And the girls or the kids are like, oh, this is awesome. Now I can totally visualize it. Meanwhile, the parents are like quietly throwing up in their own mouths as I utter the words vaginal discharge.
And egg whites, they're like, I'm done eating
egg whites. They're like, okay, you've just ruined my omelet at the diner. So that is super clear that they're seeking concrete, tangible information. I'm wondering what questions come up that are less concrete, that are like, what are the sort of, you spoke earlier about, hey, listen, one of you is going to go first and one of you is going to go last. And that can be difficult or great, depending on, what else is going on. What are the sort of social, emotional questions that come up with these groups?
Yeah. So the main social emotional one does have to do with their moods, right? So like when we talk about emotional changes, there's a concreteness to it and a more abstract idea. Because I'll ask the boys, how many of you have older siblings? Raise your hand. A bunch of them will raise their hands. So these are like teenagers. Now raise your hands if those older siblings are moody and have big moods. All the hands go up. And they then ask, like, why? Like, why is this time characterized by these moods? Like, they don't ask it that way, but they ask, like, what's up? And so we do get into the concreteness of that answer, right? That we know there's these different reasons, right? Hormones and prefrontal cortex or lack of the development. But I also then get into, and this time period in your life, there's a lot of changes going on socially. And I'll ask them, like, what do you guys think is one of the most, if not the most important things for boys and girls around 5th, 6th, 7th grade, 8th grade? And like, they'll get it. They'll eventually, like, they'll raise their hand and say, like, cell phone. And I'll go, sorta, but like, what do they do on their cell phones? And like, what we're getting at is like friendships, relationships, belonging, being liked. And so then we get into a conversation about how important that is and a little bit about how you can try and do that. That's a pretty deep conversation, though, and how hard it can be for people when things don't go the way that you want them to or expect them to. And so, for example, I'll say to them, like, you might have strong feelings or a crush on someone that doesn't have those same feelings back. And that's really hard. Or you may not have been invited to that get together. And on your new cell phone, you see on Instagram that everyone was there, but you weren't. And that's really hard. And so, yeah, there's biology involved in the moods, but there's also environment and socialization that can be really, really hard. And what I try my best to do with this. And again, these are mostly prepubescent boys. In them understanding this, I'll educate them very quickly and briefly, like, and those three big, tough emotions that we all feel, but especially during this time: mad, sad, worried. Mad, sad, worried. And when you feel those feelings, it's really important that you talk to someone about those feelings. And who do you go to? And they all immediately point behind them, our parents. Yes, you go to your parents or a trusted adult. It could be an older sib, maybe, who's mature. It could be a relative. It could be a friend. But your go-to is probably your most trusted adults. And it's really healthy and important for you to talk these feelings out and not keep them to yourself, because that can make things harder on you. And it's not healthy for you to do that. And so I'm just trying to set the table for them.
Yeah. So
for the future when that comes up for them.
At the top of the conversation, you talked a little bit about how things have changed and people are in more conversation. And I want to tie together that comment with what you just said, where we rely upon kids to identify their feelings, their emotional experiences with words, with descriptors. And I think kids have gotten a lot better at it because I think the world is doing a much better job of teaching kids all the different words they can use to describe the ways they're feeling. However, especially with kids in the earliest stages of puberty, when they're in fourth and fifth and sixth grade, sometimes there's a real miss between what they're feeling inside and their ability to identify what their feeling is and put a label on it. How do you go about teaching boys in particular, but any kid, how to label these feelings so that they can then do that mental math and go, yes, I need to go talk to someone?
Yeah, it's tricky, but it can be done. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I try to keep it as simple and easy enough to remember as possible. Just, I don't have too much time in these talks to get into the nitty gritty about like feelings and identification, but like the mad, sad, worried, I think is helpful for boys. It's quick, it's easy, it sort of rhymes, mad, sad, worried. And to be able to recognize that, and I'll give them some words that they might want to use with their trusted adults. Hey, I'm feeling really bummed or upset, or I'm feeling really bothered or angry, or I'm feeling really nervous about X. Just because I say that and model that for them doesn't mean they'll do it. It's a tough kind of bridge to get across. And so all I can do is give them some words and models for it. And then we can have parents also notice if their kids might be feeling a certain way at this age to kind of call it out, if that's the right way to say it, or to identify it and say, hey, I'm noticing you're looking X, Y, or Z. Is everything okay? Is there anything you want to talk about? You may get stonewalled, especially later in puberty, but at least you're, as a trusted adult, bringing it up.
Chris, what about, because this is a question we get in every talk we give, and something we think about in our own lives. What about the kid who just is really shut down or is just really hard to access? What advice do you have? Like, a parent has a sense, they can see that their kid needs something from them, right? Whether they're in pain or they need information or they're, looking to express something. What's your best advice for reaching boys in those moments when it feels like they're almost unreachable?
So, great question. In my experience, I see this in my office. I've seen this at times, occasionally with my own son. You have to, as a parent or a trusted adult, despite your concern that they're not talking this out, you got to take a breath and you got to be patient. And oftentimes this isn't the most satisfying answer, but I've used it and it seems to work. In your patience, you have to stay connected with him with stuff that seems very superficial and topical. And eventually, especially with young teens and middle teens, that will eventually get you to where you want to go. And that's really hard to do in therapy because it doesn't feel like therapy. Mm-hmm. You're probably not going to be able to sit down with your son and look him dead in the eye and say, how do you feel? Tell me how you feel. I think boys are much better able to do that nowadays. And over the decades, I think they've gotten much better and emotionally literate with that. But a lot of boys aren't. And so I think that oftentimes you're barking up the wrong tree trying to do it that way. And so whether you're going for walks with the dog, I can't tell you how many times moms have told me the best conversations we have and when he opens up is when we're a little bit more shoulder to shoulder instead of like eye to eye, and we're doing something. He lets his guard down a little bit more. So it's a dog walk. It could be a drive. It could be watching a show. It could be something where you're engaged in some other activity and you're thinking like, this is ridiculous. This isn't going to get anywhere. And again, I do this in my office. I'm throwing a ball with them, playing a game with them at a table. That slowly gets them to open up, and to just get them to talk about their life superficially can lead you down this path of, here's a nugget. I'm going to try and explore this. And hopefully they'll go there. So it's a great question and it's a hard answer. It's tricky with the more quiet, reserved, reticent boys, but eventually they'll get there, I think. And you have to be patient with it and not jump at any opportunity to just talk about feelings. I think boys then resist.
I want people to hear what Chris is saying, even as a trained mental health professional who has worked with kids for 25 years, who people are coming to him for therapy. Sometimes the best way in is the side door, is the conversation about fantasy football or Fortnite or, politics or whatever it is. So if a trained professional is going in through the side door, then we all have permission to not go running through the front door, but to take the screen door on the back porch and ease our way in and have what feels, as you said, Chris, like superficial conversations, not the conversation you feel like you need to be having or you wish you were having, but the conversation that's going to keep the kid connected.
Yep. And I'll give you another quick example. I remember seeing a boy who is a very late bloomer. You guys have talked about this on the pod. A very late bloomer, ninth grade at this point, he's in ninth grade, really, really noticeably smaller. I mean, noticeably. This has been an issue for this boy leading up to high school for years. The teasing, the inability to ignore the difference in sports, in whatever, right? And this is like soul crushing to this kid. He will not talk about it. He won't go there. And if you bring it up, if I've tried to bring it up, it's shut down immediately. The parents, it gets shut down immediately. And so this is an example of like, if he's not going to go there yet, you can't force this. Like, you've got to try a different way, a side door eventually that can give you some traction. So that's an example of like, and so I don't bring it up really. I still see him occasionally and he's still late. And I let him kind of drive it for me to just bring up and say, so tell me how you feel about this. He would just shut me down and shut me out.
But it brings up a really interesting point, and not necessarily about something like late bloomer who is the latest of the late, and there's something going on, the bullying, right? It's real, and there's a lot of evidence that this is something that's hard for a kid. But oftentimes, I'd say much more often than not, there is something that a kid goes through that the adults in their life are sure is an issue, and to the kid, it's not. Like, it's truly not. And the example I will use is acne. So the real learning curve for me in terms of like taking my pediatrician hat off and wearing my humble mom hat was, I really thought when my kids hit peak acne during their path through puberty, they would feel bad about it and they wanted a rescue. And it turned out that while they didn't love having acne and they had a lot of feelings about it, they were very well aware that almost everyone had acne and everyone was managing it and everyone was talking about it. And it was at the time where those stickers had first come out and people were putting things on their face and calling attention to it. And like, there wasn't a sort of a shame about it. It was almost a badge of honor. Not exactly. They didn't want the acne, don't get me wrong, but like, I was catastrophizing something that was not a catastrophe to them. And I think there's this fine line for the adults who love these kids, whether you're the parent or the coach or the educator or the therapist, where at a certain point we have to ask them how they feel. And if they say they don't care about something or it's not a big deal, sometimes we know in our gut they do care and it's a big deal, but we've got to believe what they're saying, right?
Yes. Yeah. And you leave it with ongoing sort of, I mean, parents can't turn it off, right? Ongoing sort of observations or signs that like, maybe it is a bigger deal than he or she is leading on. And maybe that's through other emotions and acting out at home or at school or whatever. Like, there might be other manifestations of it, but I agree. Yeah. If your kid is saying like, it's not that big of a deal, I think we have to honor that and then observe and pay attention to.
And observe, because what happens is then occasionally they come back a day, a week, a month later, and they say, actually, remember that conversation we had? My acne is really bumming me out and I want to do something about it.
Yep.
Chris, let's talk about for the people listening who are like girding their loins to begin these conversations. I'm sorry. I think if we went back through this episode, we would find just like a series of like really unfortunate and not even purposeful puns. But in this case, yes, for me, because I've been working with Tara too long. People are gearing up, right? They're getting ready to do this, and they have the first question, and the kid in their house decides, or you've got an educator preparing to teach this in school, or a Boy Scout leader getting ready to address this, right?
Yeah.
And they've geared up and they're ready and they start, and there's just some kids stirring the pot, asking one kind of question, and another kid just screaming penis in the corner, and another kid just like asking in a hilarious voice, and sort of all hell is breaking loose, and they've lost control, or, they've got three siblings around a table who are just sending each other off into fits of giggles and hilarity. How do we balance giving kids the chance to be silly, to be funny, to sort of work out all the kinks and discomfort through humor, without shutting down, like giving them good information without shutting down the sort of natural developmental stage that kids are at when we're having these conversations?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would call these sort of shock value questions, or, just trying to be funny. And so it's interesting, and it depends on the context, right? And so in the talks that I do, the group talks, there's occasionally shock value questions, and I have to roll with them and use my good judgment and use my sense of humor to kind of steer the conversation back. I have some little tricks that I've learned over the years to keep the boys as on track as possible, because they kind of want to get out of there as quickly as possible. And so I'll preemptively say like, hey, so like ask lots of questions, but if you're asking a question just to be silly, I'm probably not going to answer that question, and that's going to keep us here longer. It's a distraction. So like, I'm assuming you guys want to get out of here like sooner rather than later. And they're like, yeah. And so like that keeps them on track. Well, that's for me and the group process. For parents and trusted adults who are at home, one-on-one, my experience, one-on-one in my own raising of my son and in talking to lots of friends and other parents, with one-on-one, I find that there's a little bit less shock value questions. When if it's like siblings are around, maybe so. And so like, you could probably front load as a trusted adult and saying, hey, look, so, I mean, this might work. I don't know. You could try it out. We're gonna start talking about some really important and interesting things. But those things have to do with your body parts, changing bodies, and this thing called puberty, how babies get made, and all of this other stuff. And we're going to start having talks about this. And it might feel silly, uncomfortable, awkward in doing this. And so sometimes you might feel like asking a silly or question, and like, you can ask any question you want, but I just want you to know, like, what I would love is that the questions you ask are sort of serious as they can be. And if they're not, maybe I'll just sort of wink at you and say like, I'm not sure if that's like the most serious question. Do you really want me to answer that? If it's too personal or if it's completely out of line, then you set a boundary and say, I also may choose to not answer that question. But like, I get that it feels silly. It might feel silly and uncomfortable for me too. And we can have laughs and giggles and go for it in that way. But let's do our best to ask really good, curious questions if that's possible. Also, by the way, parents sometimes mistake good, curious questions for shock value questions. Mm-hmm. Happens all the time. Mm-hmm. And it happened at a talk I did recently. So here's a good example. What's 69? Well, okay, so a parent gets that. Now, it depends on It may depend on the tone and the look on your kid's face. If he's sheepish, okay, maybe you interpret that question a little bit differently. But that could be a completely reasonable, great question that
100%.
Like 100%. And so if a parent or a trusted adult is like, where did you hear that? Like we're not
everywhere.
Right, everywhere. We're not talking about that. That's an inappropriate thing to ask. That's a shutdown of that kid. And the kid's like, what's the deal? Like, what's wrong with the question? So I'll give you a quick example. At a talk, the boys are encouraged to raise their hand and ask questions. Okay, look, the reality of that is, and I'll tell the boys this, they'll think, yeah, right. I'm not raising my hand in front of a bunch of my friends and my parents and ask questions about this stuff. Like, no thanks. By the way, you'd be surprised. So many of them do. They're courageous with it and they go for it. But the other option they have is, hey, we've got a box. Here's the box. You can write down questions on note cards. Do not put your name on it. Any question you want, you write on those note cards and you put it in that box. At the end, I'll shake it up. I'll shuffle up the cards. I quickly speed screen them.
Right.
So I look for shock value questions. Usually there's not. Sometimes there might be a question that's iffy or too advanced that I know parents of the other kids are probably not going to want me to read that question out loud. So I'll skip it and I'll tell the boys, hey, if you don't hear your question asked by me, just come up to me individually at the end and we'll talk. So one of the questions on one of the cards was, what is 69? I don't know if this is shock value or just a legit question. So I don't ask it out loud. Talk ends. Parents and boys are milling about. I'm packing stuff up. This boy walks up, 5th grader, walks up with this sort of confused look on his face. And he says, Dr. Chris, how come you didn't ask my question? So clearly this is not a shock value question. This kid is totally confused. Like, why wouldn't you ask? Clearly he doesn't know what it is.
Correct.
And he's like, how come you didn't ask my question? I don't know what that is. I hear that, but I don't know what that means. Now the mom has walked up, right? And I'm talking to this kid for a minute or so, not explaining what it is yet. And the mom's like, what's up? And I said, he wrote a question, but I skipped it. And the mom's like, what did he write? So I hand the card to the mom. She looks at it. She goes, and then looks at her son with her mouth agape.
Mm-hmm.
And I do my best because I don't want him to misinterpret that as like, WTF? Why on earth would you write that? And I say, it's actually a really good question. And an honest and curious question. I just chose not to read it in front of all the other kids. And she looks at me and I'm looking at the mom and I say to the mom, how do you want to handle this? And this is kind of ideal. This is like perfect for, and the goal I have for some of these talks that I do, right? One of the goals. The mom looks at me and she's like, I got it. By the way, the mom said, oh my God, he has older brothers, right? This is where this probably came from. He's hearing things. But when I said, what do you want to do, Mom? Do you want me to explain it? I can explain it. I'm happy to explain it to him. And she's like, no, I want to do it. I got this. And like, that was like double thumbs up. Perfect. Go for it. And she did. She drove home with him and emailed me, the next day saying it was great. We talked about it. He picked himself off the floor and went about his day. So
I think what we've learned from this conversation with you, that example in particular, and this conversation in general, is the kids who are in your classroom are so lucky to have your approach and your knowledge, but the parents are just as lucky, and parents need support. They need community. As Vanessa always says, adults need trusted adults. And that story is a perfect example. You had each other's backs. Mm-hmm. You didn't shame the mom. You didn't dump on the mom. You validated the question and let the mom, respected the mom and let her decide if she was ready to answer it or not. And at the end of the day, for those of you who don't have Chris Miller in your life and on text or email or speed dial, find your trusted adult to have your back and to ping things off of, because You won't always know when a question is serious and heartfelt, or whether they're just trying to push a button. And isn't that true of so much in raising kids, but in particular when we talk about puberty and sex?
For sure. And for all the trusted adults listening, all you have to do is go to boysinstitute.com. My email's on there. Email me. I'm happy to support you from afar or close by in any way that I can. That's part of my role. That's part of my goal. So I'm happy to field any kind of questions or concerns that any parents or trusted adults have wherever they are.
Chris, thank you for being on and helping us with some tactical ways to give boys the benefit of the doubt so that we can give them really good information and teach them the skills they need to grow into adults who feel great about themselves and their relationships and their bodies. And it's a beautiful thing that you do, and we're grateful. And thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.